Chapter 4 That night Alan slept little. Even at dinner his hostess, Mrs. Waterton, noticed his preoccupation, and on the pretext of a headache he retired early to his own bedroom. His mind was full of Herminia and these strange ideas of hers. How could he listen with a becoming show of interest to Ethel Waterton's aspirations on the grand piano after a gipsy life? Oh, a gipsy life for her, when in point of fact she was a most insipid blonde from the cover of a chocolate box. So he went to bed betimes, and there lay long awake, deep wondering to himself how to act about Herminia. He was really in love with her. That much he acknowledged frankly. More profoundly in love than he had ever conceived it possible he could find himself with any one. Hitherto he had considered this girl or that, mostly on his mother's or sister's recommendation, and after observing her critically for a day or two, as he might have observed a horse or any other intended purchase, he had come to the conclusion she wouldn't do, and had ceased to entertain her. But with Herminia he was in love. The potent god had come upon him. That imperious inner monitor which cries aloud to a man, "You must have this girl, because you can't do without her. You must strive to make her happy, because her happiness is more to you now 10,000-fold than your own." That imperious inner monitor had spoken out at last in no uncertain tone to Alan Merrick. He knew for the first time what it is to be in love with a true and beautiful woman, not with his own future convenience and comfort. The keen, fresh sense it quickened within him raised him for the moment some levels above himself. For Herminia's sake, he felt, he could do or dare anything. Nay, more. As Herminia herself had said to him, it was her better, her inner self he was in love with, not the mere statuesque face, the full and faultless figure. He saw how pure, how pellucid, how noble the woman was, treading her own ideal world of high seraphic harmonies. He was in love with her stainless soul. He could not have loved her so well, could not have admired her so profoundly, had she been other than she was, had she shared the common prejudices and preconceptions of women. It was just because she was Herminia that he felt so irresistibly attracted towards her. She drew him like a magnet. What he loved and admired was not so much the fair, frank face itself as the lofty, Cornelia-like spirit behind it. And yet he hesitated. Could he accept the sacrifice this white soul wished to make for him? Could he aid and abet her in raising up for herself so much undeserved obloquy? Could he help her to become anathema maranatha among her sister women? Even if she felt brave enough to try the experiment herself for humanity's sake, was it not his duty as a man to protect her from her own sublime and generous impulses? Is it not for that in part that nature makes us virile? We must shield the weaker vessel. He was flattered not a little that this leader among women should have picked him out for herself among the ranks of men as her predestined companion in her chosen task of emancipating her sex. And he was thoroughly sympathetic, as every good man must needs be, with her aims and her method. Yet still he hesitated. Never before could he have conceived such a problem of the soul, such a moral dilemma, possible. It rent heart and brain at once asunder. Instinctively he felt to himself he would be doing wrong should he try in any way to check these splendid and unselfish impulses which led Herminia to offer herself willingly up as a living sacrifice on behalf of her enslaved sisters everywhere. Yet the innate feeling of the man that 'tis his place to protect and guard the woman, even from her own higher and purer self, intervened to distract him. He couldn't bear to feel he might be instrumental in bringing upon his pure Herminia the tortures that must be in store for her. He couldn't bear to think his name might be coupled with hers in shameful ways, too base for any man to contemplate. And then, intermixed with these higher motives, came others that he hardly liked to confess to himself where Herminia was concerned, but which nevertheless would obtrude themselves willy-nilly upon him. What would other people say about such an innocent union as Herminia contemplated? Not, indeed, what effect would it have upon his position and prospects? Alan Merrick's place as a barrister was fairly well assured, and the bar is luckily one of the few professions in lie-loving England where a man need not grovel at the mercy of the moral judgment of the meanest and grossest among his fellow creatures, as is the case with the church, with medicine, with the politician, and with the schoolmaster. But Alan could not help thinking, all the same, how people would misinterpret and misunderstand his relations with the woman he loved, if he modelled them strictly upon Herminia's wishes. It was hateful, it was horrible, to have to con the thing over, where that faultless soul was concerned, in the vile and vulgar terms other people would apply to it. But for Herminia's sake, con it over so he must. And though he shrank from the effort with a deadly shrinking, he nevertheless faced it. Men at the clubs would say he had seduced Herminia. Men at the clubs would lay the whole blame of the episode upon him. And he couldn't bear to be so blamed for the sake of a woman to save whom from the faintest shadow of disgrace or shame he would willingly have died 1,000 times over. For since Herminia had confessed her love to him yesterday, he had begun to feel how much she was to him. His admiration and appreciation of her had risen inexpressibly. And was he now to be condemned for having dragged down to the dust that angel whose white wings he felt himself unworthy to touch with the hem of his garment? And yet, once more, when he respected her so much for the sacrifice she was willing to make for humanity, would it be right for him to stand in her way, to deter her from realizing her own highest nature? She was Herminia just because she lived in that world of high hopes, just because she had the courage and the nobility to dare this great thing. Would it be right of him to bring her down from that pedestal whereon she stood so austere, and urge upon her that she should debase herself to be as any other woman, even as Ethel Waterton? For the Watertons had brought him there to propose to Ethel. For hours he tossed and turned and revolved these problems. Rain beat on the leaded panes of the Waterton dormers. Day dawned, but no light came with it to his troubled spirit. The more he thought of this dilemma, the more profoundly he shrank from the idea of allowing himself to be made into the instrument for what the world would call, after its kind, Herminia's shame and degradation. For even if the world could be made to admit that Herminia had done what she did from chaste and noble motives, which, considering what we all know of the world, was improbable, yet at any rate it could never allow that he himself had acted from any but the vilest and most unworthy reasons. Base souls would see in the sacrifice he made to Herminia's ideals only the common story of a trustful woman cruelly betrayed by the man who pretended to love her, and would proceed to treat him with the coldness and contempt with which such a man deserves to be treated. As the morning wore on, this view of the matter obtruded itself more and more forcibly every moment on Alan. Over and over again he said to himself, let come what come might, he must never aid and abet that innocent soul in rushing blindfold over a cliff to her own destruction. It is so easy at 22 to ruin yourself for life, so difficult at 30 to climb slowly back again. No, no, holy as Herminia's impulses were, he must save her from herself. He must save her from her own purity. He must refuse to be led astray by her romantic aspirations. He must keep her to the beaten path trod by all petty souls, and preserve her from the painful crown of martyrdom she herself designed as her eternal diadem. Full of these manful resolutions, he rose up early in the morning. He would be his Herminia's guardian angel. He would use her love for him, for he knew she loved him, as a lever to egg her aside from these slippery moral precipices. He mistook the solid rock of ethical resolution he was trying to disturb with so frail an engine. The fulcrum itself would yield far sooner to the pressure than the weight of Herminia's uncompromising rectitude. Passionate as she was, and with that opulent form she could hardly be otherwise, principle was still deeper and more imperious with her than passion. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. He met her by appointment on the first ridge of Boar Hill. A sunny summer morning smiled fresh after the rain. Bumblebees bustled busily about the closed lips of the red rattle, and ripe gorse pods burst with little elastic explosions in the basking sunlight. When Alan reached the trysting place under a broad-armed oak in a glade of the woodland, Herminia was there before him. A good woman always is, 'tis the prerogative of her affection. She was simply dressed in her dainty print gown, a single tea rosebud peeped out from her bodice. She looked more lily-like, so Alan thought in his heart, than he had ever yet seen her. She held out her hand to him with parted lips and a conscious blush. Alan took it, but bent forward at the same time, and with a hasty glance around, just touched her rich mouth. Herminia allowed him without a struggle. She was too stately of mien ever to grant a favour without granting it of pure grace, and with queenly munificence. Alan led her to a grassy bank where thyme and basil grew matted, and the hum of myriad wings stirred the sultry air. Herminia let him lead her. She was woman enough by nature to like being led, only it must be the right man who led her, and he must lead her along the path that her conscience approved of. Alan seated himself by her side and took her hand in his. Herminia let him hold it. This love-making was pure honey. Dappled spots of light and shade flecked the ground beneath the trees like a jaguar's skin. Wood-pigeons crooned unseen from the leafy covert. She sat there long without uttering a word. Once Alan essayed to speak, but Herminia cut him short. "Oh, no, not yet," she cried half petulantly. "This silence is so delicious. I love best just to sit and hold your hand like this. Why spoil it with language?" So they sat for some minutes, Herminia with her eyes half closed, drinking in to the full the delight of first love. She could feel her heart beating. At last Alan interposed and began to speak to her. The girl drew a long breath, then she sighed for a second as she opened her eyes again. Every curve of her bosom heaved and swayed mysteriously. It seemed such a pity to let articulate words disturb that reverie. Still, if Alan wished it, for a woman is a woman, let Girton do its worst, and Herminia not less, but rather more than the rest of them. Then Alan began. With her hand clasped in his, and fondling it while he spoke, he urged all he could urge to turn her from her purpose. He pointed out to her how unwise, how irretrievable her position would be if she once assumed it. On such a road as that, there is no turning back. The die once cast, she must for ever abide by it. He used all arts to persuade and dissuade, all eloquence to save her from herself and her salvation. If he loved her less, he said with truth, he might have spoken less earnestly. It was for her own sake he spoke, because he so loved her. He waxed hot in his eager desire to prevent her from taking this fatal step. He drew his breath hard and paused. Emotion and anxiety overcame him visibly. But as for Herminia, though she listened with affection and with a faint thrill of pleasure to much that he said, seeing how deeply he loved her, she leaned back from time to time, half weary with his eagerness and his consequent iteration. "Dear Alan," she said at last, soothing his hand with her own, as a sister might have soothed it. "You talk about all this as though it were to me some new resolve, some new idea of my making. You forget it is the outcome of my life's philosophy. I have grown up to it slowly. I have thought of all this, and of hardly anything else, ever since I was old enough to think for myself about anything. Root and branch, it is to me a foregone conclusion. I love you. You love me. So far as I am concerned, there ends the question. One way there is, and one way alone, in which I can give myself up to you. Make me yours if you will, but if not, then leave me. Only remember, by leaving me, you won't any the more turn me aside from my purpose. You won't save me from myself, as you call it. You will only hand me over to someone less fit for me by far than you are." A quiet moisture glistened in her eyes, and she gazed at him pensively. "How wonderful it is," she went on, musing. 3 weeks ago I didn't know there was such a man in the world at all as you. And now, why, Alan, I feel as if the world would be nothing to me without you. Your name seems to sing in my ears all day long with the song of the birds, and to thrill through and through me as I lie awake on my pillow with the cry of the nightjar. Yet, if you won't take me on my own terms, I know well what will happen. I shall go away and grieve over you, of course, and feel bereaved for months, as if I could never possibly again love any man. At present it seems to me I never could love him. But though my heart tells me that, my reason tells me I should some day find some other soul I might perhaps fall back upon. But it would only be falling back. For the sake of my principles alone, and of the example I wish to set the world, could I ever fall back upon any other? Yet fall back I would, and what good would you have done me then by refusing me? You would merely have cast me off from the man I love best, the man who I know, by immediate instinct, which is the voice of nature and of God within us, was intended from all time for me. The moment I saw you, my heart beat quicker. My heart's evidence told me you were the one love meant for me. Why force me to decline upon some other, less meet for me? Alan gazed at her, irresolute. But if you love me so much, he said, surely it is a small thing to trust your future to me. The tenderness of woman let her hand glide over his cheek. She was not ashamed of her love. "Oh, Alan!" she cried. "If it were only for myself, I could trust you with my life. I could trust you with anything. But I haven't only myself to think of. I have to think of right and wrong. I have to think of the world. I have to think of the cause which almost wholly hangs upon me. Not for nothing are these impulses implanted in my breast. They are the voice of the soul of all women within me. If I were to neglect them for the sake of gratifying your wishes, if I were to turn traitor to my sex for the sake of the man I love, as so many women have turned before me, I should hate and despise myself. I couldn't love you, Alan, quite so much, loved I not honour more, and the battle imposed upon me." Alan wavered as she spoke. He felt what she said was true. Even if he refused to take her on the only terms she could accept, he would not thereby save her. She would turn in time and bestow herself upon some man who would perhaps be less worthy of her. Nay, even on some man who might forsake her in the sequel with unspeakable treachery. Of conduct like that Alan knew himself incapable. He knew that if he took Herminia once to his heart, he would treat her with such tenderness, such constancy, such devotion as never yet was shown to living woman. Love always thinks so. But still he shrank from the idea of being himself the man to take advantage of her, for so in his unregenerate mind he phrased to himself their union. And still he temporized. "Even so, Herminia," he cried, bending forward and gazing hard at her, "I couldn't endure to have it said it was I who misled you." Herminia lifted her eyes to his with just a tinge of lofty scorn, tempered only by the womanliness of those melting lashes. "And you can think of that?" she murmured, gazing across at him half in tears. "Oh, Alan, for my part, I can think of nothing now but the truths of life and the magnitude of the issues. Our hearts against the world, love and duty against convention." Then Alan began again and talked all he knew. He urged, he prayed, he bent forward, he spoke soft and low, he played on her tenderest chords as a loving woman, Herminia was moved, for her heart went forth to him, and she knew why he tried so hard to save her from her own higher and truer nature. But she never yielded an inch. She stood firm to her colours. She shook her head to the last, and murmured over and over again, "There is only one right way, and no persuasion on earth will ever avail to turn me aside from it." The truth had made her free, and she was very confident of it. At last, all other means failing, Alan fell back on the final resort of delay. He saw much merit in procrastination. There was no hurry, he said. They needn't make up their minds one way or the other immediately. They could take their time to think. Perhaps, with a week or two to decide in, Herminia might persuade him, or he might persuade her. Why rush on fate so suddenly? But at that, to his immense surprise, Herminia demurred. "No, no," she said, shaking her head. "That's not at all what I want. We must decide to-day, one way or the other. Now is the accepted time. Now is the day of salvation. I couldn't let you wait and slip by degrees into some vague arrangement we hardly contemplated definitely. To do that would be to sin against my ideas of decorum. Whatever we do, we must do, as the Apostle says, decently and in order, with a full sense of the obligations it imposes upon us. We must say to one another in so many words, 'I am yours, you are mine,' or we must part for ever. I have told you my whole soul. I have bared my heart before you. You may take it or leave it, but for my dignity's sake, I put it to you now. Choose one way or the other." Alan looked at her hard. Her face was crimson by this with maidenly shame, but she made no effort to hide or avert it. For the good of humanity, this question must be settled once for all, and no womanish reserve should make her shrink from settling it. Happier maidens in ages to come, when society had reconstructed itself on the broad basis of freedom, would never have to go through what she was going through that moment. They would be spared the quivering shame, the tingling regret, the struggle with which she braced up her maiden modesty to that supreme effort. But she would go through with it all the same. For eternal woman's sake, she had long contemplated that day. Now it had come at last. She would not weakly draw back from it. Alan's eyes were all admiration. He stood near enough to her level to understand her to the core. "Herminia," he cried, bending over her, "you drive me to bay. You press me very hard. I feel myself yielding. I am a man, and when you speak to me like that, I know it. You enlist on your side all that is virile within me. Yet how can I accept the terms you offer? For the very love I bear you, how do you this injustice? If I loved you less, I might perhaps say yes. Because I love you so well, I feel compelled to say no to you." Herminia looked at him hard in return. Her cheeks were glowing now with something like the shame of the woman who feels her love is lightly rejected. "Is that final?" she asked, drawing herself up as she sat, and facing him proudly. "No, no, it's not final," Alan answered, feeling the woman's influence course through body and blood to his quivering fingertips. Magical touches stirred him. "How can it be final, Herminia, when you look at me like that? How can it be final when you're so gracious, so graceful, so beautiful? Oh, my child, I am a man. Don't play too hard on those fiercest chords in my nature." Herminia gazed at him fixedly. The dimples disappeared. Her voice was more serious now, and had nothing in it of pleading. "It isn't like that I want to draw you, Alan," she answered gravely. "It isn't those chords I want to play upon. I want to convince your brain, your intellect, your reason. You agree with me in principle. Why, then, should you wish to draw back in practice?" "Yes, I agree with you in principle," Alan answered. "It isn't there that I hesitate. Even before I met you, I had arrived at pretty much the same ideas myself, as a matter of abstract reasoning. I saw that the one way of freedom for the woman is to cast off, root and branch, the evil growth of man's supremacy. I saw that the honourableness of marriage, the disgrace of free union, were just so many ignoble masculine devices to keep up man's lordship, vile results of his determination to taboo to himself beforehand, and monopolise for life some particular woman. I know all that. I acknowledge all that. I see as plainly as you do that sooner or later there must come a revolution. But, Herminia, the women who devote themselves to carrying out that revolution will take their souls in their hands, and will march in line to the freeing of their sex through shame and calumny and hardships innumerable. I shrink from letting you, the woman that I love, bring that fate upon yourself. I shrink still more from being the man to aid and abet you in doing it." Herminia fixed her piercing eyes upon his face once more. Tears stood in them now. The tenderness of woman was awakened within her. "Dear Alan," she said gently, "don't I tell you I have thought long since of all that? I am prepared to face it. It is only a question of with whom I shall do so. Shall it be with the man I have instinctively loved from the first moment I saw him better than all others on earth, or shall it be with some lesser? If my heart is willing, why should yours demur to it?" "Because I love you too well," Alan answered doggedly. Herminia rose and faced him. Her hands dropped by her side. She was splendid when she stood so with her panting bosom. "Then you decide to say good-bye?" she cried with a lingering cadence. Alan seized her by both wrists and drew her down to his side. "No, no, darling," he answered low, laying his lips against hers. "I can never say good-bye. You have confessed you love me. When a woman says that, what can a man refuse her? From such a woman as you, I am so proud, so proud, so proud of such a confession. How could I ever cease to feel you were mine, 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 wholly mine, for a lifetime?" "Then you consent?" Herminia cried, all aglow, half nestling to his bosom. "I consent," Alan answered, with profound misgivings. "What else do you leave open to me?" Herminia made no direct answer. She only laid her head with perfect trust upon the man's broad shoulder. "Oh, Alan," she murmured low, letting her heart have its way. "You are mine, then. You are mine. You have made me so happy, so supremely happy." End of chapter 5. Chapter 6. Thus, half against his will, Alan Merrick was drawn into this irregular compact. Next came that more difficult matter, the discussion of ways and means, the more practical details. Alan hardly knew at first on what precise terms it was Herminia's wish that they two should pass their lives together. His ideas were all naturally framed on the old model of marriage. In that matter, Herminia said, he was still in the gall of bitterness and the bond of iniquity. He took it for granted that of course they must dwell under one roof with one another. But that simple ancestral notion, derived from man's lordship in his own house, was wholly adverse to Herminia's views of the reasonable and natural. She had debated these problems at full in her own mind for years, and had arrived at definite and consistent solutions for every knotty point in them. Why should this friendship differ at all, she asked, in respect of time and place, from any other friendship? The notion of necessarily keeping house together, the cramping idea of the family tie, belonged entirely to the regime of the man-made patriarchate, where the woman and the children were the slaves and chattels of the lord and master. In a free society, was it not obvious that each woman would live her own life apart, would preserve her independence, and would receive the visits of the man for whom she cared, the father of her children? Then only could she be free. Any other method meant the economic and social superiority of the man, and was irreconcilable with the perfect individuality of the woman. So Herminia reasoned. She rejected at once, therefore, the idea of any change in her existing mode of life. To her, the friendship she proposed with Alan Merrick was no social revolution. It was but the due fulfilment of her natural functions. To make of it an occasion for ostentatious change in her way of living seemed to her as unnatural as is the practice of the barbarians in our midst who use a wedding, that most sacred and private event in a young girl's life, as an opportunity for display of the coarsest and crudest character. To rivet the attention of friends on bride and bridegroom is to offend against the most delicate susceptibilities of modesty. From all such hateful practices, Herminia's pure mind revolted by instinct. She felt that here at least was the one moment in a woman's history when she would shrink with timid reserve from every eye save one man's, when publicity of any sort was most odious and horrible. Only the blinding effect of custom, indeed, could ever have shut good women's eyes to the shameful indecorousness of wedding ceremonial. We drag a young girl before the prying gaze of all the world at the very crisis in her life when natural modesty would most lead her to conceal herself from her dearest acquaintance. And our women themselves have grown so blunted by use to the hatefulness of the ordeal that many of them face it now with inhuman effrontery. Familiarity with marriage has almost killed out in the maidens of our race the last lingering relics of native modesty. Herminia, however, could dispense with all that show. She had a little cottage of her own, she told Alan, a tiny little cottage in a street near her schoolwork. She rented it for a small sum in quite a poor quarter, all inhabited by workpeople. There she lived by herself, for she kept no servants. There she should continue to live. Why need this purely personal compact between them two make any difference in her daily habits? She would go on with her schoolwork for the present as usual. Oh no, she certainly didn't intend to notify the head mistress of the school or any one else of her altered position. It was no alteration of position at all, so far as she was concerned, merely the addition to life of a new and very dear and natural friendship. Herminia took her own point of view so instinctively indeed, lived so wrapped in an ideal world of her own and the future's, that Alan was often quite alarmed in his soul when he thought of the rude awakening that no doubt awaited her. Yet whenever he hinted it to her with all possible delicacy, she seemed so perfectly prepared for the worst the world could do, so fixed and resolved in her intention of martyrdom, that he had no argument left, and could only sigh over her. It was not, she explained to him further, that she wished to conceal anything. The least tinge of concealment was wholly alien to that frank, fresh nature. If her headmistress asked her a point-blank question, she would not attempt to parry it, but would reply at once with a point-blank answer. Still, her very views on the subject made it impossible for her to volunteer information unasked to any one. Here was a personal matter of the utmost privacy, a matter which concerned nobody on earth save herself and Alan, a matter on which it was the grossest impertinence for anyone else to make any inquiry or hold any opinion. They two chose to be friends, and there, so far as the rest of the world was concerned, the whole thing ended. What else took place between them was wholly a subject for their own consideration. But if ever circumstances should arise which made it necessary for her to avow to the world that she must soon be a mother, then it was for the world to take the first step, if it would act upon its own hateful and cruel initiative. She would never deny, but she would never go out of her way to confess. She stood upon her individuality as a human being. As to other practical matters, about which Alan ventured delicately to throw out a passing question or two, Herminia was perfectly frank, with the perfect frankness of one who thinks and does nothing to be ashamed of. She had always been self-supporting, she said, and she would be self-supporting still. To her mind, that was an essential step towards the emancipation of women. Their friendship implied for her no change of existence, merely an addition to the fullness of her living. He was the complement of her being. Every woman should naturally wish to live her whole life, to fulfil her whole functions, and that she could do only by becoming a mother, accepting the orbit for which nature designed her. In the end, no doubt, complete independence would be secured for each woman by the civilized state, or, in other words, by the whole body of men who do the hard work of the world, and who would collectively guarantee every necessary and luxury to every woman of the community equally. In that way alone could perfect liberty of choice and action be secured for women. And she held it just that women should so be provided for, because the mothers of the community fulfil in the state as important and necessary a function as the men themselves do. It would be well, too, that the mothers should be free to perform that function without preoccupation of any sort. So a free world would order things. But in our present barbaric state of industrial slavery, capitalism, monopoly, in other words, under the organised rule of selfishness, such a course was impossible. Perhaps, as an intermediate condition, it might happen in time that the women of certain classes would, for the most part, be made independent at maturity, each by her own father, which would produce for them in the end pretty much the same general effect of freedom. She saw as a first step the endowment of the daughter. But meanwhile there was nothing for it save that as many women as could should aim for themselves at economic liberty, in other words, at self-support. That was an evil in itself, because obviously the prospective mothers of a community should be relieved as far as possible from the stress and strain of earning a livelihood, should be set free to build up their nervous systems to the highest attainable level against the calls of maternity. But above all things we must be practical, and in the practical world, here and now around us, no other way existed for women to be free save the wasteful way of each earning her own livelihood. Therefore she would continue her schoolwork with her pupils as long as the school would allow her, and when that became impossible, would fall back upon literature. One other question Alan ventured gently to raise, the question of children. Fools always put that question and think it a crushing one. Alan was no fool, yet it puzzled him strangely. He did not see for himself how easy is the solution, how absolutely Herminia's plan leaves the position unaltered. But Herminia herself was as modestly frank on the subject as on every other. It was a moral and social point of the deepest importance, and it would be wrong of them to rush into it without due consideration. She had duly considered it. She would give her children, should any come, the unique and glorious birthright of being the only human beings ever born into this world as the deliberate result of a free union, contracted on philosophical and ethical principles. Alan hinted certain doubts as to their upbringing and education. There, too, Herminia was perfectly frank. They would be half hers, half his. The pleasant burden of their support, the joy of their education, would naturally fall upon both parents equally. But why discuss these matters like the squalid rich, who make their marriages a question of settlements and dowries and business arrangements? They two were friends and lovers. In love, such base doubts could never arise. Not for worlds would she import into their mutual relations any sordid stain of money, any vile tinge of bargaining. They could trust one another. That alone sufficed for them. So Alan gave way bit by bit all along the line, overborne by Herminia's more perfect and logical conception of her own principles. She knew exactly what she felt and wanted, while he knew only in a vague and formless way that his reason agreed with her. A week later, he knocked timidly one evening at the door of a modest little workman-looking cottage down a small side street in the back wastes of Chelsea. 'Twas a most unpretending street, Bower Lane by name, full of brown brick houses, all as like as peas, and with nothing of any sort to redeem their plain fronts from the common blight of the London jerry-builder. Only a soft serge curtain and a pot of mignonette on the ledge of the window distinguished the cottage at which Alan Merrick knocked from the others beside it. Externally, that is to say, for within it was as dainty as Morris wallpapers and merino hangings and a delicate feminine taste in form and colour could make it. Keats and Shelley lined the shelves. Rossetti's wan maidens gazed unearthly from the overmantel. The door was opened for him by Herminia in person, for she kept no servant. That was one of her principles. She was dressed from head to foot in a simple white gown, as pure and sweet as the soul it covered. A white rose nestled in her glossy hair. 3 sprays of white lily decked a vase on the mantelpiece. Some dim survival of ancestral ideas made Herminia Barton so array herself in the white garb of affiance for her bridal evening. Her cheek was aglow with virginal shrinking as she opened the door and welcomed Alan in. But she held out her hand just as frankly as ever to the man of her free choice as he advanced to greet her. Alan caught her in his arms and kissed her forehead tenderly. And thus was Herminia Barton's espousal consummated. End of chapter 6.